Okay. Well, why don't we get started? As everybody knows, we are recording the event this evening, and the recording will be made available later on the UVA Club's website in the coming days so that you can watch again and you can share with friends. Hello, and my name is Elizabeth Muse, and I'm the Senior Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement in the Office of Engagement. And I am so pleased this evening that we have Nathan Moore with us, the manager at WTJU. Nathan's going to share a little bit about the history of the station, a little bit on his background, and then he's going to help us launch a behind the scenes video of WTJU. After the video, we'll have time for question and answers from the audience. If you want to, you can go ahead in the chat function and just let us know where you are joining us from this evening. And if you've got a relationship to the radio station, that would be super fun. We can also do that after the video. So let me turn that over to Nathan right now to get us started.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks for inviting me to be a part of this UVA Clubs event this evening. And just to, I guess, kick things off too, we are in the middle of our classical marathon, which we've been doing every year since the early 1960s. So right now is 7 days around the clock classical music specials. Also a fundraiser if anybody's still moved that direction. But I don't want to belabor that too much. My name's Nathan Moore, like Elizabeth said, and I've been the manager here for not quite 10 years, but coming up on it. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this college and community radio station at UVA. Yeah, WTJU is a pretty fantastic operation. There is a short 10 or 12 minute video tour of the inside of it that we're going to take a look at. Since COVID hit, we have been closed to the public, so people can't really stop by and actually sort of see the studios in person unless they've got a show. But I'll talk about that a little more in the video itself. And just before that gets going, I'm just glad to see a few names that are recognized, and glad to have you all here tonight. So let's roll the video.
Hi, and welcome. This is WTJU at our Ivy Road studios here in Charlottesville. We're outside now, and this is normally closed to the public for the pandemic. We're not letting people in normally, but you get a behind-the-scenes tour, so welcome. My name's Nathan Moore. I'm the manager of WTJU, and let's go on in. All right, my handy camera person is gonna follow me in. Let's get a shot of the stage here. This is normally a place where we do live concerts. I don't know if I should say normally. In the before times, this is a place where we did live concerts. I'm going to turn this off. We actually have a lot of HEPA air filters running at all times to keep the air sort of recharged so that any, sort of airborne virus is actually, sort of caught by the HEPA filter anyway. But yeah, this is a lovely spot. There's a drop-down screen in the back. We can show films. We've got all kinds of lighting and stuff. We do video out of here. And again, in the before times, we would have at least 2, sometimes 3, 4, 5 live acts each week in this space. Right now, it's unfortunately just a lot of storage. Every time things get delivered here, they just kind of pile up because we don't really have a whole lot of staff working out of the building at the moment. Some, we come in and check in and gather things and take care of tech once in a while, but largely we're not here. So. In fact, right now we're here during a time when it's a pre-recorded show, so we're gonna go take a look at the studios. Oh, and hey, we can show the plants are actually taking over in the absence of humans, so you can come on up and locate, and then we can take a back shot. So we just came up the stairs, and this is the main floor of WTJU, where all of our air studios are. We have 2 radio stations here, WTJU 91.1 FM, which has been on the air since 1957. It started as a nearly all classical music station. Nearly all students back in the 50s at UVA with its original studios in Old Cabell Hall. This is the, it went to Old Cabell and then the basement of Humphreys and then the basement of Peabody and then Lambeth Dorms, and then now this is the 5th location right here on Ivy Road. And so we moved here in March of 2019. So this is kind of a general volunteer workspace. All the DJs on WTJU are volunteers, and we've got well over 100 DJs on that station. They come in here and prep their shows, listen to some music, preview what's going on the air. It's also a spot that during normal times will be converted into a phone answering room during pledge drives. So we are funded partly by university student fees, partly by some grants, but the biggest source of support is from listener donations. And so during pledge drives, like a regular public radio pledge drive, we sit up in here, and this is where we take your calls. During the pandemic, that's been a little changed. We're actually taking pledge calls from home. So we have the phones forwarding to whatever volunteer is answering phones at the time. It forwards to their personal phone, and that's why they don't take your credit card information at home. But they can still take your pledge, which you can pay later. This is also kind of the thing I like about our design here is that in the new space, we have about 40,000 records, vinyl records. And we're actually able to bring all those over. When I was laying out the space with UVA Facilities Management, we actually laid it out with extra wide hallways so that we could line the hallways with all of our records. And so this is the jazz section over here. And we'll kind of track along. And then let's come on around here, because then coming down this way, we've got two more whole sections, or two more whole sides rather. This is all of our rock, classical music coming back this way, and then around the corner is our blues. You might have noticed at the back of the stage downstairs, that's actually where all of our folk and world and roots and reggae and all those kind of genres are as well. So a lot of records, and we brought them all over. We also have a library in the back that's full of CDs, just in drawers. They're not, that room's kind of a mess. But it is also a place where we keep all of our CDs. We've got about 32,000 of those. We've also got an 8 terabyte server full of music, MP3 files. And so our DJs have a lot of options to choose from as far as what they play and how they play it. And that's one of the kind of cool things about WTJU. There's a few things that make the station stand out. One is that everybody in here is a volunteer, which is definitely unusual. Another is that our hosts program their own shows. There's not like a set rotation that they have to pull from. It's just the DJ's in charge. And so they come in, and as long as they're, you know, more or less in line with the genre that they're a part of, then that's all fine. And we have 4 main departments at WTJU. There's the classical department. So again, it started as a classical station. We still have a lot of classical music programming. We also now have a jazz department, jazz and blues, folk and roots, and then a rock, etc. department. And all those really, it's a station for people with big ears. All those are pretty expansive departments in terms of how we define them and the kind of overlap and interplay of how those genres fit together. If it's good music, at some point it'll be played on TJU. You can bring it on in here. Mm-hmm. So this is WTJU's main air studio here for 91.1 FM. And you can see some of the measures we've taken in here as well for the pandemic. We did remain open throughout the entire quarantine and lockdown, again, though, with pretty strict controls. And so we've got the plexiglass barrier between mic 1 and mic 2 for any guests we have. We also have lots of isopropyl alcohol to wipe down surfaces between shifts. We have another HEPA air filter running in here. And in general, all the measures that one can do to keep people physically distant and safe for all the things that we do. If you want to bring it around this way, just to get a little closer look at how the actual operation works. One of the phrases I like to use for WTJU is that we're technologically agnostic, which is kind of true. Again, you saw the vinyl outside. I talked about the CDs, but here's our CD players. We've also got our 3 turntables here and DJs actually use them. It's not just for show. We have some hosts who do a lot of vinyl or all vinyl shows. In fact, a guy who goes by Rum Cove on the air, who is on the air on Monday afternoons, does a classic soul and R&B show. 3/4 of his show is actually all 45s, not even LPs. He plays all 45s. He thinks the wide groove's the best. We've also got, line input for people bringing in their laptops. You can play anything on a stream from the screens that we've got. And then this is all basically, it's a really cool digital mixer. And so that was part of our move into the space, was building out a whole new digital audio infrastructure for WTJU's operations. And so this mixer is connected to the one in the production studio, is connected to the one in WXTJ. Our student station is connected to a secondary broadcast studio downstairs. And so we can send audio from one to another with the push of a button. The reason why that's useful is well, there's a lot of reasons why it's useful. If we're having a live band on the stage, we can just pot them up in either of the air studios. Our downstairs studio is our ADA accessible studio. It's our chair accessible studio. And so if we have a host doing a show down there, Again, we just push a button and they're on the air from downstairs instead of from up here. And it's got all the same basic equipment down there. And all the rest. It's just really convenient to be able to move audio around the building in the ways that we do. Otherwise in here, we got kind of a closer look at how this works. Basically, the mixer looks kind of complicated, but really most of what we're talking about is just, this is the label of what it is. So we've got mic 1, mic 2, that's this and that. Turntables, CD players, PC in is the computer, obviously, a phone to put a phone call in the air, the downstairs studio, and our automation stream. Everything you're looking at is essentially just an on button, an off button, and a volume. And that's the gist of how it works. Now, this is during the middle of an opera performance, so I'm not actually going to say anything on the microphone, but that is basically how it goes. So this is our production studio. This is where we come in to record interviews, cut tape. It's also where our podcast collective is based out of. So WTJU operates a community podcast collective. We have about 15 or 16 shows in active production right now. A few of those are actually like WTJU productions. Most of them are by volunteers who are students or community members who want to get their feet wet in podcasting and make a go of it. And so we provide a lot of the support, including tech support, studio resources. We do free distribution, a little bit of marketing, and then a peer network with lots of meetups and trainings and workshops and things like that. And so it's a nice group of audio producers that all are part of that. So over here we've got, again, socially distanced these days with the plexiglass and the distance, a couple of microphones to record an interview. It's been used not a ton during the pandemic, but it is here as a resource. Again, with all the things to keep it safe with isopropyl and distance and a HEPA air filter that's right over here that I just turned off. Cute little mixer here. Again, it does all the things we need it to with 4 mic inputs, as well as the computer, the aux, and actually Bluetooth as well. So we can just connect any Bluetooth device and make a phone call and record it via Bluetooth, which is kind of cool. One thing this board does that I don't need it to, but it's still kind of awesome, is these little hotkeys that have sound effects. We can program those to other things, but why? Other kind of cool thing about this room is that it is interior. There's no window to the outside, but there's a window to the student radio station, WXTJ, and also a window across the hall, which you can kind of see if the camera points this way, back to the air studio. And so if, for example, we had a guest in here or some kind of talk show happening in here, and we were throwing it to air from here, the DJ in the main studio and this studio could coordinate with hand signals or whatever and just kind of do the handoff. All right, so this is a bit of an odd thing. The WTJU camper is an old 1971 camper that I picked up from a guy in Farmville. We gutted it and turned it into a mobile studio. And so, again, before the pandemic, we were using that to collect oral histories from different UVA alumni reunions. We have deployed it 5 or 6 times per year over the last couple of years. 2020, it really hasn't seen any use, which is why it's a bit mucky and dirty right now. It's going to need some cleanup before we get it back out there again, but kind of a cool resource to have. Big, giant blue WTJU camper. We're just down the hall from where we started this tour. And this is yet another air studio, WXTJ, which is our all-student-run, all-student staff station here right next to WTJU. This is a newer station. It just went on the air in April of 2016. Actually happened to be on Founders Day, which was sort of an accident, but it was appropriate. WXTJ has about 130, 140 students involved. During the pandemic, about half of them are coming to host shows in the studio, and then every other show is actually hosted from home. And so that's one of the things we spent a lot of time investing in back in the spring and early summer, was a lot of tech build out to figure out how to get 70, 80 people be able to broadcast from home studios. It was a hell of a lot of logistics work plus tech work, and we did get it done. And so there's nobody in here right now. All the students have now left for the semester, the winter semester, but we're just feeding in automated programming at the moment. But even that is also curated and selected by students, and little interstitial voice bits also by students. And so as far as how the tech on this goes, this station broadcasts with about 30 watts from Observatory Hill. We have a little 20-foot pole there with a radio transmitter on it. And so it reaches about 4 or 5 miles, about as far as downtown or Rio Road to the north. Then WTJU broadcasts with 1,500 watts from top of Carter Mountain. And so it's going to reach more like 30 or 40 miles. So you can pick it up as far south as Dillwyn, as far southeast as, I don't know, far Louisa, and as far north as Madison County, or maybe even Culpeper if you have a good receiver in your car. And so, yeah, we keep the radio thing going pretty well, and we've kept the service going pretty well during the pandemic as well. On top of the regular radio broadcasting, of course, we're also digital. We've been streaming online for years at WTJU.net for the main for the full power station, and then at WXTJ.FM for the student station. And we also have the podcast collective, and we've also been doing a bunch of other kind of fun, just sort of digital programming here and there. Monthly radio talk series about local music and community radio. We did my personal favorite project we did was called Make Some Joy, where we asked listeners to play the first 8 bars of Beethoven's Ode to Joy on any instrument they could come up with. And I mean, more than a dozen people actually sent us video submissions of that, so we shared that as well. That one wasn't for air, but it's just kind of a fun way to connect music and people during a time when we all need connection, which is really the point of WTJU, is that connection through good music and conversation. So that's the basic gist of the tour, and I thank you for coming.
That was great, Nathan.
Thanks. It's funny. I'm used to listening to myself, but watching myself is a whole different thing. I don't know if I like it.
Well, it is wonderful. I could see smiles as we were going through that, which was fantastic. I invite anybody who is participating with us, if you want to ask a question, please do put it in the chat. You can also raise your hand, which you just put, I believe the reactions, you can put like the little hand up, or you can just give me a shout in the chat and I will go ahead and pull you in. I do have questions that were submitted in advance. So Nathan, I'm gonna jump in and start off with that piece. You talked a little bit about the history of the station when you were beginning. Can you delve a little bit more? Because just taking a peek across this, I think we have folks who have joined us from multiple generations. And I imagine some of the history that you briefly touched upon actually really touches upon the experiences of some of our participants tonight.
Sure. So I came to the station in 2011. And so what I know about the history of the station is just what I've read or heard from a few people over the years. But from what I understand, kind of like what I mentioned, it did start off as a predominantly classical station, predominantly students, if not all students, back in the late 50s. And of course, all male, because UVA was all male at the time. Mm-hmm. And it carried on that way into the 60s. There was kind of a first golden era, from what I understand, where there was, I've talked with a couple of guys who were, let's see, Mike Leach and Joe Bordeaux, who were the program director and general manager at the time. And they told some stories about just kind of silly stuff, like things that we do now where we can kind of like broadcast in via Zoom or any kind of other IP-based thing. They actually sort of hacked the phone system in Charlottesville at the time, so they could do the news reports in the morning from their bedroom. And so, it's always a place that's always had that kind of DIY spirit about it, even back in the early 60s. By the late 60s, or maybe 1970, 71, the station really did start to shift quite a bit. Of course, UVA let women in, but also a lot of the cultural and social changes happening in the country also happened at TJU. And so the station added, a lot more rock programming, and then also some more jazz programming, and eventually some folk and roots programming as well. And so, the 70s and 80s were this kind of classic quintessential time for college radio in a lot of ways. And I see a few names here that were definitely part of that era in the 80s and 90s, or rather, 80s and even early 90s for college radio. So the station carried on with 4 main departments, classical, jazz, rock, and folk. And at various times, a news and public affairs department as well. I heard that for a little while there's a little bit of sports broadcasting going on, but that's not been a major thread in the history of the station, to my knowledge. So these days, so then the station was really just a student organization, very vibrant student organization for a long time. And then sort of became this what they used to call special status organization. And so it hired its first paid staffer in 1993, a guy named Chuck Taylor, just like the shoe. And Chuck would Chuck kind of shepherded things along. And I think also sort of oversaw a bit of a shift from a sort of classic all-student college radio environment to like kind of a hybrid community radio station, college radio station. And he was around for quite a while. He was on staff until 2010. In early 2010, he retired. There's a bit of a drama around his replacement who didn't last very long. And then I was hired in 2011 and have tried to revitalize student interest and participation. That's a big part of why we have a second radio station, WXTJ, while also strengthening the listenership and fundraising around TJU, which is now pretty much, kind of like a more of a public community radio model with XTJ on this sort of student radio model. And they both work in tandem these days pretty well.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic. I have a question for you about WXTJ in just a minute, but looking at the chat, Steve, and then his last name just went away from me. He says he works in the news department at WTJU in the early 80s. Is there still a news department today?
There's a little bit of one. So we don't have any full-on news shows. Just, by the way, my own background was quite a bit in news and public affairs before I came to TJU. I used to work as the news director at a community radio station in Madison, Wisconsin, called WORT, and then I was at Pacifica Radio for a few years. So, I definitely have some of that, and I have a real drive and passion to collect and share community stories on air. But the primary brand of TJU really is music, eclectic music, music you're not going to hear elsewhere, music that pushes boundaries, but also kind of pulls people together around this sort of, cool place. I'm not using words real well, but we do have a little bit of news and public affairs. We do a daily little news package at 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. We also have the thing, though, that's not really news exactly, more public affairs, that I really enjoy is what we call Sonic IDs. And so these are like little short, less than a minute audio portraits that will go. So the way it works is we'll go do 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen interviews on a particular topic. And that might be senior citizens Virginia talking about their legacies, or undocumented immigrants in Charlottesville just talking about their lives and what they deal with, or parenting during COVID, and then we'll slice up those interviews and pull out these little nut graphs and turn them into short little audio portraits that air throughout the whole program schedule. And so we interweave those little public affairs bits into the music programming, with one spot every hour or two. And it's a nice way to kind of pull in some of those stories in this little short form way that just kind of punctuates the music programming. And I mean, nobody complains too hard about it, and some people really like it. So
that is fantastic. That's a great way to bring information, especially as you were talking about the local reach of the towers to people that are really going to be interested in exactly what you're speaking about.
Yeah. Oh, and Elizabeth, before the next question, I should also mention we do have a pair of news podcasts. Each one is bi-weekly, and so there's one called Soundboard that's Charlottesville. It's a partnership with Charlottesville Tomorrow. So that's a news public affairs talk program. And then I actually host a state politics explainer podcast called Bold Dominion. Both of those air on Saturday mornings at 6 o'clock in the morning, which is not really an ideal time for radio, large audiences, but they are sort of a podcast first that we also put on the air. And so, yeah, the podcast collective is where a lot of our news and public affairs has gone. We also now these days have the staff at the Cavalier Daily is actually doing a podcast with our collective too. So, we that digital space has opened doors for new forms of audio production that weren't really a big part of the station when I first got here.
Fantastic. That is quite an area of growth. And especially as you're talking about different community organizations and students as well. We will make sure when we send a follow-up information out to everybody who's participated and registered, we will send a link to the podcast collection so we can make sure we really get that in the hands of everybody who's interested. Okay, we had another question come in from Margaret Blum. Impressive collection, and I love the term potted up. Is it still in use even in this digital age? I worked at the WFOS in Chesapeake in the mid 90s when pots were still in use.
Pot ups like the levels for on the board.
I think that must have been exactly what she was talking about.
Yeah, it's still a slang term we use. You pot up the levels. What's funny about that digital mixer is it looks just like a mixer from 20, 30, 40 years ago in certain respects, right? You got the buttons and the volume fader and all that. These days, though, there's no actual audio passing through it, which is the crazy thing. All the audio is actually, we still use analog vinyl records and CDs and all kind of stuff that's analog, but we don't, the actual mixer though, so everything gets converted to a lossless digital audio stream. And so every channel has its own stream. Turntable 1 has its own stream. Turntable 3 has its own stream. Every microphone has its own stream. And then the board is actually just like a giant mouse with a whole lot of buttons. And so you're actually controlling it. You're controlling different audio feeds with the board. And it's made to look like an analog board, but it actually is digital. It's kind of cool. But yeah, we still pot up the levels.
That is such a great answer, because when I was reading this question, I was like, I don't actually know what this question is. I'm so glad you picked up on it right away.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's inside baseball jargon. It's great.
Perfect. We also had Richard Norman, and he said there were jazz programs in 1963 during exams. I'm guessing, Richard, that's when you were a student, and they were broadcast around the clock. And that was just a great little piece.
They started that early. Cool. I knew that there were some jazz shows early on as kind of like not the main part of the programming, but that there was a little bit. And I knew the classical marathon started early as a way to sort of like help students study by. So back then in the early days, TJU was not on 24/7. It was just kind of a 8-10 hour a day thing when students were available, from what I've heard. The classical marathon, the first one they did was like the special thing. They were going to go 24 hours to help students study around the clock. And it was kind of paired around exams week. In fact, we still, this week during the classical marathon happening right now, is also, well, exams week technically was last week, but close enough. The timing remains in place, even, 60 years later. But yeah, that's cool. I didn't realize that they had that y'all had done a jazz marathon that early on. That's really cool.
So great. You never know what you're going to learn in these great conversations. Bill Bruckner has asked, is the AM station WUVA still around?
WUVA, long story short, there is still a station called WUVA. It is no longer a student thing in any way. So quick thumbnail on WUVA is that they got an FM frequency at some point. And it operated it was the weirdest thing. I've never seen anything like it elsewhere in the country, really. It was by the time I got here anyway, it was ostensibly student run. It had a student board, but with a professional staff of like paid hosts. It was an independent 501c3 operating a commercial radio station. It was a really peculiar combination of factors on that organization. Long story short, the alumni board of WUVA eventually decided to actually sell the FM frequency to one of the commercial radio groups in town. They've used that money and they basically just sort of live off the investments of it and use it as a digital video production space for students who want to get into TV or other video production. So that's cool. It's part of the media ecosystem at UVA still, just not FM radio at all anymore as far as students go.
Thank you for that piece of history. And David Wright says, I'm a community DJ in my 15th year on WQFS Guilford College Radio. When I came on board at WQFS, it was like coming home to WTJU. That's wonderful. Hi, David. I can see your photograph.
And WQFS, that's one of the oldest ones in the country, isn't it?
David,
you're muted, actually. You can unmute. Oh, you unmuted and then remuted. There you go.
There we go. We are celebrating our 50th year as a college radio station, and it was 50 years ago that I became a DJ at WTJU.
Oh, that's really cool. You must have been there during that transition I was talking about, where a lot more rock got added.
It was, and I remember doing the classical marathon and butchering pronunciations of classical musicians and composers.
We still have a little book in the studio. It's called the Classical Announcer's Pronunciation Guide. You know, it's still a challenge sometimes.
Thank you. And we have from Richard Norman, I remember one weather forecast given late at night during exams. Dark tonight, lighter tomorrow. I think DJs could play almost anything during exams. But it was mostly classical, as he said.
Okay, got it. Dark tonight, lighter tomorrow.
Lighter tomorrow is the weather forecast.
Yeah.
Well, Nathan, you've been talking a lot about WTJU. David was just talking about another college radio station. What other stations are there like WTJU that are out there? And then sort of the same way, the student aspect, because you were talking about WXTJ as the student side. So what does that look like around the country for different institutions?
Sure. You know, the story on there's a wide variety of college stations, you know, stations sort of owned and run by their colleges or universities. There's a handful that are relatively well resourced, kind of like TJU. There's a lot of college stations out there that run on tiny budgets of just a few $1,000s a year, and it's just kind of a ragtag thing. And you know, if students don't show up for a few years, there's no station anymore. I would say, though, that there's definitely, it's interesting in 2020, 21 coming up, I assume will still be the case. You know, there's still a lot of interest in students getting involved in radio and making radio, being in the studio and making it work. I don't think very many students are approaching it these days as a training ground to be future DJs. That's not kind of why they do it. But they definitely do it for the community aspect and for the kind of like building a campus culture. And that exists a lot of places. There's you know, some hundreds of small college radio stations around the country. As far as kind of the community radio model that WTJU is now also part of, you know, we're at a university, and WTJU, the 91.1 signal, does a lot with the university still. We kind of are this bridge between the community and the university in a number of ways. You know, so that's a little unusual. There are some other college stations that have gone that route. And then you've got universities that run just big NPR affiliates. That's also very common. As far as the community radio world, though, you know, I'm a big part of the, I'm a big fan of and very involved with the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, which is pushing 200 stations around the country that are radio stations built for and by their communities, you know, so people who come on and do broadcasting that's really local and trying to help build more resilient communities and serve the cultural and sort of news and information and public safety needs of the places they live. And so, yeah, I'm actually the president of the board of that organization.
Wow,
But
well,
yeah, so there's a lot of stations around that are doing really cool work. And I found also in research over the last few years, there's a bunch of college radio stations in Virginia, just Virginia too. There's about 20 of them. And so I started an organization called the Virginia College and Community Radio Alliance. We actually registered as a 501 just earlier this year. And we've been holding an annual conference, you know, by Zoom this year, where we get all these stations together to kind of learn from each other, see what's working at certain places. And, you know, it's not like we're just the station that knows everything, you know, telling all the other stations what to do. I mean, we learn from them too. WXTJ actually at a conference year before last, they learned a bunch of stuff and kind of changed around the structure of their sort of management team. And yeah, it's been, you know, this year in particular, trying to figure out like, how do you navigate COVID, you know, because programming has gotten more complicated, finance has gotten more complicated, university relations has gotten more complicated, events and marketing and, you know, throwing shows is all kind of, you know, really complicated. So yeah, it was a good year to learn from each other. And I'm glad to be able to pull stations together to do that.
Well, I was going to say you're the passion that you just talked about, the national organizations being put together, what you have done in Virginia to bring those 20 different radio stations together. It's sharing that passion. And question that came in is sort of about that footprint that WTJU, Phil, UVA class former host, Cameron Dodge, early music show, said Nathan was doing some work to expand the geographic broadcast reach in Virginia. is that still where you're at, or have you been able to, you talked about the miles that we were able to do.
Yeah.
Since
Well,
Cameron was part of it.
I had an idea, and it was a good idea. There was a station that was for sale in the Richmond suburbs. It was actually based in Ashland, and we had we essentially leased that station for a couple of years, and it didn't work. Is the short version. It's tough. It's tough to enter a whole new market. Plus, there were some tech issues. The signal didn't reach as far as we thought it could. So long story short, we're focusing a lot more strongly on Charlottesville and its region for our main broadcast. And I think I still have an interest in collaboration with stations and media organizations of all kinds that are based around the state. But I think the thing, as far as like our own core radio operations, focusing on Charlottesville for now is a good thing.
That is a great thing. That is a great thing. Aaron Margosa said, I heard a while ago the idea of DJ curated content, meaning DJs deciding what to play, was nearly extinct, and that WTJU is one of the last holdouts in the country. Is that true? You were talking about that during the video. Can you add a bit more to that on Aaron's question?
Yeah, I think Aaron's right. And hey, Aaron, it's good to see that you're here. Yeah, I think community radio and college radio is about the only place left where that's the case. In the commercial radio space, the talent there largely, has all their playlists set for them by a program director who might not even live in the same city. And even with public radio, there was a fairly there's a story recently where there's a classical music service called Classical 24 that feeds into a lot of public radio stations. And after sort of the George Floyd murder earlier this summer, one of their hosts sort of veered from the playlist and kind of played a bunch of composers of color, and because without getting clearance for it ahead of time, and actually got fired for that. So I mean, we're definitely an exception to all that, where it's pretty close to free form. I mean, we had a folk host some years ago who, was playing regular kind of folk and roots and outlaw country and whatever it was he was playing. And then all of a sudden he plays Moon River. And we're kind of like, huh? And the folk director went and kind of asked him, was like, hey, why'd you play Moon River? It's a good song and all, but it's not really like our usual thing. And he's like, oh, I know. My grandma called and requested it. And we're like, okay, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, we've even got a few shows that are like truly freeform. There's a show on Monday afternoons, every other Monday afternoon, called Ken's Last Ever Radio Extravaganza, which is highly unusual listening. It's a 2-hour live improvised audio collage. And so the host brings in just a laptop full of like 20 or 30,000 samples. And so there'll be songs, they kind of flow over each other, and he's got sounds, and he'll bring in a live phone call and then like start looping the phone call back on itself during the live broadcast. And it's a wild show. And it's the kind of thing that, I mean, some people absolutely hate it, but it's also a cool experience if you're kind of open to it.
Well, and I think that goes to the creativity part that you're talking about, that you were talking about sharing the information amongst different radio stations, wanting to keep WTJU exciting in the moment relative for the future. You had Michael Latsko, current announcer and a WTJ volunteer since 1993, just wanted to say that Nathan totally rocks.
Thanks, Michael. I enjoyed your show today.
So I'm going to give that shout out from Michael. And I had some questions that were sent in advance. Bob Noley, College 1977. Will we have another alumni weekend soon? And Jeff Miller, Architecture 97, said that as well. Gave his great history, said he was programming director at WTJU 76, 77, following Hank Clifford. Station manager was Tom Moody. Have you ever connected with them regarding WTJU? Like, they were great and back in the 70s. Russ Perry was on the air with me until he graduated in 76. He listens to you streaming because he lives in Connecticut and wants to make sure you guys get together soon. So that was a lot of names.
Well, the cool thing, so I'll do the last bit first, which is I think I've met Tom Moody, but I can't put a face with it right now. But Russ Perry actually is kind of a cool story because he was a broadcaster on TJU. He was a DJ back when he was a student in the early 70s. He graduated and he occasionally, sort of hosted as a community member off and on as well. But, he had a whole career as an architect for, 30 some years. He's now retired and he came back and had this idea. He's a big fan of jazz. Loves jazz. His personal collection of jazz records, like 12,000 jazz records. He's read probably 50 books on the history of jazz. And so he had this idea to trace 100 years of the history of recorded jazz over 100 episodes. And so we did. We launched a show called Jazz at 100. And Russ hosted it. And it's not just like every year. It's not like that. It's thematic, And it's a phenomenal show. And it was so good that I was like, we got to syndicate this. And so we put it up in PRX, the Public Radio Exchange, which is one of the sort of sharing sites in the public radio marketplace. So other stations can pick it up. And we've got like 12 or 13 other stations around the country that have picked up Russ's show, which is really neat. I love that. And so, we do our part for the jazz community kind of nationally, I guess. So Russ is back. He's been around for a while and he's a great addition to the station. As far as getting together, I love get-togethers. COVID's been hard. I enjoy being sort of an extrovert. I get energy from it, and that's been one of the hardest things about all this is that it's nice to see people on a screen, but it's definitely not the same as the experience of experiencing music together and just experiencing that moment and connection and real life stuff. We have done special kind of, alumni hosted shows during reunions weekends. We've had some gatherings, during some of the bigger anniversaries for the station. I definitely would love to do those more. And again, it might just be a little bit before everybody gets vaccinated. Although we have also done a couple of one-off events. And one of my favorite ones ever was just last November. David Berman passed away last August, and he was a pretty well-known indie musician and poet, and much loved by fans and fellow Charlottesville people who knew him. And so a number of alums kind of were wanted to do something to kind of mark it. And so since WTJU had just moved into these new studios early in the year, you saw the stage. It's not a big space. It's got room for about 30 seats, 35 seats. But I said, we could use that. It'd be a great spot. And we did, so a lot of alums came back. We sort of assembled some on the fly bands that could play David's music. We had a celebration. They grilled some corn dogs, which I guess is a thing they did, 30 years ago. And so it was like one of those special communal moments when you feel such a real, genuine connection with people. And to me, that's what TJU is actually about is, it's about the music. Yeah, it's about exploring new music and curating set lists that are really powerful. Yeah, it's about FM broadcasting. I was just doing a bunch of FM tech stuff today. But that's really kind of the how. The why we do it is that genuine human connection. And that's what I love about it.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. I want to make sure I didn't miss any questions. If I did not answer your question that you put through, because I think some of them were going, please go ahead and re-ask a question. If anybody has anything else, I want to make sure that we answer your questions, or just make sure I can give your comments over to Nathan. And Nathan, you've talked a little bit about how hard it has been during the pandemic, but also, I'd love to know a little bit about, how WTJU has thrived during the pandemic. Like, what has an opportunity been there that you hadn't even thought about going into, whether for WTJU or for the student station?
So, a lot of the video was really showing some of the things we've done. You saw the plexiglass and the isopropyl alcohol, and we all wear masks on the way in and out. I've got a really, really, unbelievably talented tech volunteer who just lives to code. And so, between his skills and some other software we put together, we figured out a way to have dozens of people broadcast remotely from their homes, and just at the push of a button, switch from one home studio to another. And so, all this semester with the students back and with like half of the students have been broadcasting from home. And then I've got another probably 12, 15 community members broadcasting from home as well. So we've got probably like 70 people broadcasting from home. And it took some pretty fancy tech footwork to make that happen. But it's really cool that we were able to do that. A lot of college stations and a lot of, frankly, community stations too, they just shut down their studios. They just flipped it over to automation, pre-recorded what they could. We didn't do that. And, to my knowledge, we haven't had any cases linked to the station. And so, I guess you could say it's worked okay, but that's because, we were cautious about it, but we also wanted to keep serving the community. And so, at the end of the day, I mean, one of the things that non-commercial radio can really excel at, is that, and community radio can really excel at, is that we're there for public information and public service. And in those early acute days of the pandemic, we could push out updates from Charlottesville Tomorrow and the local health district. We could, also provide spaces to just kind of connect and recharge. And it's worked pretty well. The pledge drives we've done since then have actually gone all right. We've met our goals and actually exceeded them. Now, some of the other funding, the revenue streams are a little tough. A lot of our underwriting from businesses is down because so much of it was based around events and restaurants and things like that. But I mean, financially we're doing all right. And I feel incredibly privileged and grateful that that's the case, because so many arts organizations are really struggling. It's not to say that we don't need continued support, like the pledge drive happening right now. But nonetheless, it's really phenomenal to be part of something that, radio is like the original wireless, right? Like 100 years ago, and it still is kind of amazing to me. I think about the technology of it, and you don't have to be connected to in the presence of other people's, with their clouds of potentially COVID hazards to listen to radio. You can enjoy radio from all over the place. And I think about the tech of how it works. And I know how every step of that tech works. Like, I know my voice hits this microphone and it vibrates a tiny little thing inside that microphone. And that vibration gets transferred to an electric signal that goes down this cable. And then at the radio station, it goes through a few different kind of like audio processing tools, and then it goes into this T1 line that gets sent up to Carter Mountain, and then it gets put into this exciter and this transmitter and turned into like an FM radio signal up to the antenna out into the air, right? And it's still, even though I know every step of that tech, it still feels like magic. And that, people can just be in their cars or at home or whatever and listen to my voice or any DJ's voice on TJU and feel a sense of connection and feel like something real. It just feels like magic.
Well, and that's that passion again that has just bubbled up over and over and over during our conversation, and also that creativity part that you and somebody who is a tech savvy person got together to figure out how to, I'm going to use the word patch. I have no idea if that's it. The different places that come together when other radio stations were shutting down, but you came up with a solution for that. That's phenomenal. I mean,
I think it's a DIY spirit. The DIY thing has been part of TJU going way back, and I know Aaron on the call here is part of a scene, or was part of a scene in the day that was very explicitly DIY around punk and Discord records and all the rest. But it's all about taking like limited resources and figuring out some cool stuff you can do with it.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. And Aaron, actually speaking of it, said WTJ reunions are generally on the 5-10 year anniversary. So 1957, the next one should be 2022.
Yeah, we ought to be COVID safe. We ought to be out of the COVID woods by then.
Yeah. Perfect. And I think that's about the questions that I have. Does anybody else have a question or just want to give a shout out? People have said hello. Gail and Ed Kitch say, thanks so much for doing this. David Wright had said, see Tom Petty, the last DJ. I think that's a reference to something for Tom Petty. Anybody else just have a last question for Nathan? He's been so great to film the tour of the studio for us and spend all of this time.
Yeah, this is Aaron. Nathan, you're telling about the DIY and how you patch these things together. Tell the story about the time where the connection between the studio and the antenna on Browns Mountain went down, and you used your own personal iPhone to connect the
Yeah,
studio
sure.
to the antenna.
Oh, this is great. Yeah, sure, I can do that. Yeah. So our transmitter's actually in Carter Mountain, up there past the Apple Barn. If you've ever been up there, if you kind of look up on the top of the mountain, there's all those towers up there. That's where half the radio stations in town have their transmitters and antenna, including TJU. And so the way every one of those stations has to get their audio from the studio to the tower to the mountain one way or another. The way we do it is a point-to-point T1 connection. Basically, there's like a long piece of copper, that just pipes the audio straight up there. There was an issue shortly after now it seems almost passe, but back in 2011, it was kind of a cool parlor trick. So I had an early generation iPhone back then, and our transmitter, or rather the STL, the thing that carries the audio up, the studio transmitter link, was down. And it was down because lightning had struck nearby. It zapped the power supply on this thing. It was gonna be like 2 days or more before it arrived. I'm like, I don't want to wait 2 days to be back on the air. And there was no backup at the time. There's no backup STL, studio transmitter link. And I was kind of trying to think through it. I was like, well, our web stream is still working. Okay. So I could just hit play on my phone. I'm like, oh, I can play the web stream on my phone just fine. And so I wonder if I could. And so, yeah, I just basically took some cabling and plugged my phone into the back of our transmitter, and we were just broadcasting off my iPhone for a couple days, which actually worked remarkably well. Now, I should say I forgot to turn on call forwarding at first. And so whenever somebody called me, the radio station would fade down, ring for 30 seconds, and then fade back up. And so I had to eventually go up to the top of the mountain and fix that. But but yeah, it kept us on the air by hook or crook for a couple of days while we waited for the new part to come in.
So your phone was on the top of the mountain?
Yeah.
That's truly amazing. Aaron, thank you so much for dropping in and making sure he shared that story.
Yeah, I didn't have a phone to use for a while. Now we've since made a little bit better backup, but it's the same basic idea. We just now use more of a hotspot router.
That's fantastic. Anybody else have a question or a story prompt? I will call that one. No? Nathan, anything that you would like to share with the group? I know you've given us so much information on what the station has been doing, how you've kept students engaged and busy, the impact that you've had on the Charlottesville community. You mentioned the campaign that is going on right now. Is there anything else you want to make sure we take away with us as we come to a close tonight?
One of the things I am asked somewhat often is it's like, is radio still alive? Is radio still going to be there in a few years? And I do think there will be something called radio in the years to come. I do think FM radio is going to, have a sapping away of audience, but there will be radio. There will be radio stations. There will be audio that we listen to. And I feel like a big part of my job is trying to figure out where that's going and to position us in a way that we can do it and be relevant to it. Because the need for people to connect with one another in the same space where they live, that doesn't go away. The need for people to connect with other human voices and with other music that moves us, that doesn't go away. And, sort of adapting to the tech changes and being a part of it and being kind of like an R&D lab to sort of try things out and get things working and then foist it on other stations to let them try if they want to too. I love that role that we can do that and to try and adapt this really neat, really local model of audio production for the mid 21st century.
Well, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us tonight for UVA Club's program. And for everyone, thank you for joining us for the behind the scenes with WTJU. This was quite an experience for all of us. And as I said, we will send out information, anything, Nathan, the podcast that you'd like to send out the details on, any information about the station and how people can get more involved. So again, thank you for joining us for a UVA Clubs program.
Thanks so much.
Have a great evening, everyone.